Good afternoon and good evening to our friends and colleagues in the United Arab Emirates. We have quite a distinguished group of panelists who've joined us today, all of whom I'm proud to say I can count as my friend and colleague. I intend to briefly introduce each of them, and please allow me to emphasize the brief because each of whom has a very in-depth career that they have brought to the table. So their bios are quite extensive, and I want to allow as much time as we can to engage with our panelists and with our participants. But before I begin our discussion today, I would like to just offer a few guidelines, if I may, as well on the specifics for our panel discussion today. So I'd like everyone to please keep in mind that in order to maintain as much stability in our technology platform, if everyone would please mute until you wish to be engaged or you're going to engage a participant. It will really help us enormously, I believe, to try to keep our conversation going. Also, I wanted to make sure that everyone, our participants in particular, please use the chat button to register your interest in a question. We are very anxious to hear all of your questions, and we will do our best to make sure everyone can be recognized. Because our panelists, I'm quite confident, will give us quite an animated discussion and a lot to comment on. But before I introduce our guest, I also wanted to just acknowledge our dear friends and colleagues in Lebanon who really suffered a horrendous tragedy yesterday with a massive explosion at the port of Beirut. I hope we will all pause and remember. I commented earlier today to our Emirati friends how touching it was to see the Burj Al Khalifa lit up and what that represented. A real call to action to stand together in the midst of what is just a horrific tragedy. So with that, I would like to, it's my honor to recognize our panelists. So briefly, Capricia Marshall served as White House Social Secretary in the Clinton administration and as our Chief of Protocol in the Obama administration, where, as her book speaks so well, she enhanced traditional protocol methods with new tools to build relationships between dignitaries, the private sector, and where she oversaw many, if and all, of the diplomatic details of multiple state visits, convenings, and summits. She currently serves as president of Global Engagement Strategies and is ambassador in residence at the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center. Now, if I may turn to His Excellency Zaki Nusseibeh. Zaki serves, it's very difficult, if I may say, to do a brief bio on Zaki, but he currently serves as Minister of State, where he oversees public and cultural diplomacy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is cultural advisor at the Ministry of Presidential Affairs. That really isn't a fair representation because he doesn't oversee, he stimulates and really embraces all of his colleagues in the various sectors in the UAE to really recognize and embrace all the multitude of and richness of the fabric of cultural life and experiences in the Emirates. And I really look forward to hearing him share that connective tissue. He is able to do that because he started his journey, as we all start our journey somewhere. His Excellency accompanied the late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan in the 60s, where he witnessed the beginnings of what we now know as the modern Emirates. In accompanying Sheikh Zayed Al Nahyan, the first president of the UAE, he became translator, interpreter, and advisor. And I'm sure he'll comment a little bit on how critical those interpreting skills are as we set the table for diplomacy, business meetings, and other engagements. his richness of his portfolio, and has he spoken to me so often about the criticality of storytelling, will help us today weave that fabric that we so desire on enhancing our engagement. Shihab Al-Faheem, His Excellency, is the Assistant Undersecretary for Protocol, or if you will, AKA the UAE's Chief of Protocol, Capricia's counterpart. And I'm hoping the two of them will provide rich engagement and anecdotes. Shihab will look forward to some companion anecdotes that Capricia has provided us in her book. Shihab came to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a rich background in the private sector. He began at the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. He then transitioned to the head of retail banking in Abu Dhabi's Islamic Bank. He comes to our table, literally and figuratively, to his career with a rich background engaging with the private sector. And now, as the Chief of Protocol, where he sets the table with distinguished heads of government and senior government officials in hopes of creating a richness of ongoing engagement. Our colleague, Donna Al-Marashi, is the head of the UAE's Mission Embassy Cultural Diplomacy Department at the UAE's Embassy in the US. In this capacity, she manages the embassy's outreach, philanthropic, cultural initiatives, programming to promote understandings of the UAE within the US, as well as enhancing and broadening and deepening the appreciation of cultural and heritage of the UAE. She has a rich toolbox of experience in art, cultural, and the engagement world, which we look forward to hearing so much more about. So as we embark on this discussion, I hope that you will share me in engaging and welcoming our panelists. So let me begin with Capricia Marshall, and I would like for all of you, we're going to reference, Capricia, forgive me, we're going to speak about the power of diplomacy and how to make it work for you, and as you have done brilliantly in your book. And I think it provides a really rich landscape of engagement. We're looking forward to hearing from you your experiences and how you set the scene and how you set the table. Your book gives us a snapshot inside what I have to tell you. There were times that you allowed us to see those hair-raising moments of the life of a chief of protocol. Yes, full disclosure. I was on the edge of my seat from time to time. Some of them I even knew very well. And I took a long breath and thought, oh my gosh, how is Capricia going to get out of this one and create a positive outcome? And sure enough, she dug in that toolbox, and yes, she did. She made it happen. So I am very excited for us to have you here at this table, and honored that I can count you as a friend and colleague, one whom I respect and admire very, very much. And I look forward to having you share with us your experiences. So Capricia, let's start off. Share with us a little bit about, as you were writing this book, you had to do a lot of self-reflection. And it's not just on the past. I'm quite confident, knowing as I know you, you were obviously noodling on those experiences and bringing it forward. So let me turn the discussion, if I could, to you, Capricia. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, my dear, dear friend. Let me first say it is an incredible honor to be on this panel with His Excellency, the Minister of State. He is legendary around the world. We all are just are constantly feeling most privileged with the words that you share with us, the experiences, and of course, the lessons that we follow. As well, it is so wonderful to see the face of my dear, dear friend, Shihab. We have shared many wonderful experiences together. I'm glad to hear that he is doing well and his family is healthy and safe, particularly those adorable children. And Donna is amazing in the office here in the United States. She just does so well to bring the culture of the UAE to the footholds of the US for all of us to experience, for those who are not fortunate enough, like you and I, Toni, to travel to the Emirates and get to experience the beauty, the food, and of course the amazing culture. And so it's wonderful, my dear, dear friend Toni, to join you and to have you moderating this discussion with all of us. Let me first start off with what most people do not particularly understand is what is protocol and why is protocol important? Protocol sets the wheels of diplomacy in motion. It creates a literal foundation for diplomacy. Before our presidents, royal family, kings, queens, before they enter a room, before they pick up a pen, we have completely designed that experience from the physical setting to, of course, the mindset of the experience. And it's imperative to have protocol in place because we create this roadmap for these discussions, big and small, that our leaders will need to follow. And I have to say, when leaders do not adhere to protocol, when they don't follow our advice, mistakes happen. There's confusion of message, confusion of purpose that sometimes can even lead into malintent. And we certainly don't want any of that when we are at this very high level negotiating a treaty that needs to be signed, an agreement that we need to engage in, or just having a discussion between bilateral friends. So the foundation, these principles of protocol are so very important. They have been important for years, and His Excellency will discuss this, I am sure. But it's even more imperative today as we are sitting in this time of confusion and where things are not clear. There's a tremendous fog on how do we move forward? What should our social codes of conduct be? How do we create a framework for our engagements again in this virtual space like we are this afternoon, this evening? All of that is dependent upon these critical tools of protocol.
Capricia, thank you very much. Zaki, if I may turn to you and ask you your thoughts and how do you see this, Capricia's comments about the role of protocol and diplomacy, which you have experienced, as I pointed out briefly in your bio, but I really appreciate your sharing with us how you see it now and how you would project it for the future in terms of using these smart tools of diplomacy. Zaki?
Thank you very much, Stan. Once again, it's such a great honor to be with my great friends again, although we are seeing each other virtually because of this pandemic that has caused chaos all around us. I am particularly happy to see one of our young and rising stars in diplomacy and cultural diplomacy and protocol, Shihab, join us to tell us about some of his experiences. Let me start before touching on Capricia's important book, a book I believe should be truly a handbook for every person who is involved in cultural diplomacy and in protocol. But before I touch on this, let me start with what you have started with, Stan, to tell you how much my heart bleeds for what has happened and is happening in the Lebanon. My heart and the hearts of everyone I know around us, both in the Arab world and in the West and in America, throughout the world. And for me, Lebanon was what protocol and cultural diplomacy was all about. If I were to go back to the 60s when we started this wonderful journey that Sheikh Zayed took us on in order to build a new state. The first Arab countries we turned to in order to help tell our story as the United Arab Emirates was, of course, in addition to Egypt, Lebanon. Lebanon was the oasis of stability. It was, in effect, a center for cultural flowering, it had a free press, it had writers, it had poetry, it had art, it had music. And in order to tell our stories, because countries, governments, whether newly established or old and established, always need cultural diplomacy and protocol in order to tell their story. We turned to Lebanon in order to do this. And I'm so sorry to see it bleeding today. And it shows us where things can go wrong, and when things can go wrong, how a whole society can disintegrate around us. Now, Capricia's book, of course, I found amazing because I saw myself echoing many of the experiences she went through. And I mean this on a smaller scale. I mean, she was serving the president of the major superpower of the country, of the world, and I was serving my president, a small country that had started from very tough beginnings. And this is where the story of cultural diplomacy and protocol come in. Because for Sheikh Zayed, it was very clear that in order to succeed in his project for establishing this new state in the heart of the turbulent region in which we were living, he needed to tell our story. He needed to convince others of our story. He needed, as Capricia would say, to bridge and communicate what this project was all about. And it was not easy. In the 60s and 70s, people thought it was an impossible dream. And it took us 50 years of working solidly with Sheikh Zayed, even before things like cultural diplomacy and soft power and smart power became popular lexicon of diplomacy. Sheikh Zayed worked with us in these domains because he truly believed what is important is that we transmit our story. We tell our story so that we start to establish a solid network of strategic partnerships with countries around us. And the only way to do this is not only to attract them through economic, financial, commercial interests, but also to show them that we share a common moral values, the same moral values that drive us together. And Sheikh Zayed was able to succeed in this. And this is why when I come now 50 years later, and I see where we have reached today, and looking at young people like Shihab and others around him, I feel very proud where this process of cultural diplomacy and smart power and diplomacy as a whole, the foreign policy priorities of our country has led the Emirates where we are today, where our investment in education and culture has established for us a youth generation that is capable this year alone of conquering both space and nuclear energy. And I believe that through working with this youth, working towards the future, continuing with our soft power, smart power, if you like, policies and priorities, we can continue to work into the next 50 years. And I believe the next 50 years are going to be tough. I mean, there is no way of hiding this fact, not only in this region, which continues to be a turbulent one, but also around us. I mean, this pandemic has showed us how the first response of countries was to start building walls to separate themselves from those around them. And yet we know that in order to survive as humanity, we must work together, we must collaborate together, we must in effect support the international, the multinational institutions that bring stability and security to the world. And therefore, I believe it is the mission of everybody involved in diplomacy, in foreign policy, in protocol, to work and work together across frontiers in order, despite of this initial separation between nations, to try and bring nations back together, to try and support the multinational institutions and regulations and organizations that really work towards stabilizing our very unstable environment.
Zaki, you continue to inspire me exponentially. I embrace your words and your reflections. Thank you for sharing with us. So Shihab, Zaki has mentioned you multiple times in his remarks. So bring to the table for us, share with us your perceptions, your perspective, and let's get a little granular. Our presidents, our Secretary of State, we have multiple engagement. We have a very active engagement with the Emirates on multiple levels. And we will soon turn to Donna also to have her share with us how she bridges some of what you're teeing up. So let's share with us a little bit your perspective and the toolbox you have. And do you have enough tools in that toolbox currently as you look at what the landscape that Zaki has just laid out for you? So over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Your Excellency, for your remarks. To begin with, about tools, all chiefs of protocol, all people in protocol are innovative when it comes to tools. We make our own tools along the way. We improvise, we compromise, and we reach the solution. At the end of the day, we want to avoid being stuck. And there is a syndrome that we always try to avoid, which is the ostrich syndrome, putting your head down and thinking that things will work. So this is something that we always try to avoid, and we have to be very creative. I'm very glad that Capricia has done this book, because every time we speak to someone, they always tell us, do you have a guide? Do you have a protocol guide? So this, I think, will serve as a very good protocol guide. And chiefs of protocol always have the juiciest stories. Some we can't say, some we can. And I think Capricia was very restrictive in her stories, but it was still very exciting to know and hear. To us, protocol, given the UAE's location, given the importance of how it connects people from around the world, we're the first country that managed to host a UN entity, IRENA, that we won in hosting in 2009. And then we are hosting the expo, which was postponed due to the pandemic. So all of those help us also in protocol, because we're going and working in order to make sure that we're hosting things in the right way. Protocol, we see it as the oil of diplomacy. It's the oil that, or the bloodline of all relationships. For us, we do the rehearsals, we do the preparations. Our principals do not do that. We put their visions and their what they want to reach out into perspective, and we try to always go and work with this one. But we do the rehearsals, we do all the work in order to reach the goal that they're trying to portray, to reach the goal of the country, to enhance the relationship of other countries, and to avoid major embarrassments. And it always makes a difference when we work with guests and they find out that we took an extra step or two in studying them and knowing what they like, and knowing what they want, and making them feel home. Recently, the previous Indian ambassador went home and he wrote a very nice article. He was here during the visit of Prime Minister Modi, and he was talking about how His Highness the Crown Prince, when welcoming him, told him that, welcome to your second home, which is something that we usually say to our guests. So we're very happy that we're trying to portray this to our guests and our state visits, because this changes the way we treat and deal with the country. And we see it in terms of the UAE's diplomatic relations with countries, the UAE's passport ranking, the UAE's trade relations with a certain country. And it always feels good, because when we work in protocol, we're creating history every day. It's not a job, it's history in the making. So we're part of this history, and we have to make sure that everything goes well. When you're behind the scenes and you're trying to take a picture, things might be messy, but the picture will be great. So our job is to be on this side, make sure that we have the perfect lighting, make sure that we have the meals and everything, and then we prepare. I don't want to take more of your time, but I have so much to say. But again, let me know so that we can engage.
Thank you very much, Shihab. Donna, I'd like very much to have you bridge for us. You've heard the richness of your colleagues, and Capricia, all have mentioned art, diplomacy. We did not specifically mention the delegations, but that underpins what we do. The delegation issue, what you do, what we all do in our work, but delegations are a little bit more complex in a pandemic environment. So as we transition to another part of our discussion, I would like all of our panelists to also touch on that issue of how we look at I see it as an opportunity not to replace ever a delegation because I desperately miss our friends in the Emirates, and I'm looking forward to coming back tomorrow, frankly. No, I'm just joking. But how we can use this new technology tool that we're on right now. So please speak to us about your experiences, what you've done so richly convening the museums. But I want to also have you touch on the issue of culinary diplomacy as well. And literally setting that table, Capricia, Zaki, Shihab, they've now all indirectly or directly touched on this. So set the table for us, if you will, and how you have used cultural food diplomacy in part of as a tool for your toolbox and our respective toolboxes.
Thank you, Toni. I think to start things off, I'd love to give credit to Ambassador Yusuf Al-Ateba for actually having the foresight to create the Department of Cultural Diplomacy in the United States almost 10 years ago now. You know, as he traveled around the United States, meeting with various members of communities, both senior and, you know, just regular Americans, he realized that you know, there was an element missing that people knew of the UAE in terms of the trade relationship and business deals, but they didn't know very much about the country in terms of the people, in terms of our values, our culture. And so he realized the importance of soft power in helping to actually achieve his goals. And that was why he set up the Department of Cultural Diplomacy. You know, during this time, during, you know, Corona, we've had to kind of shift our focus in terms of having our people-to-people connections, which we've so grown accustomed to. We've had to find ways of being able to still reach our audiences. And so we've been convening a lot of these, you know, Zoom talks, but we've also, especially during Ramadan, when, you know, the embassy always hosts our friends from the United States to talk about Ramadan, to talk about the month of Ramadan, we decided to host virtual iftars. And it was a wonderful opportunity because we were able to connect not only with our friends from the United States, but also our friends from the UAE as well. You know, when we do events at the embassy, we're normally constricted or restricted to having people only from the Washington, D.C. area. Whereas because it was all virtual, we were able to, you know, connect with our friends from the West Coast as well as from the East Coast. And so I think, you know, this has definitely been a tool that we want to continue using in the future when life hopefully does return to normal, that we continue kind of taking lessons learned from this time to be able to use it going forward. And I think talking about culinary diplomacy specifically, you know, we hosted a wonderful discussion in Washington, D.C. Last year, and you received the book, Toni, of Table Tales from our friend Hanan Worrell, where she speaks about different residents in Abu Dhabi, and His Excellency Zaki was one of them. But it's an opportunity to be able to tell their stories, but also give you an insight into different cultures, because through food, you're able to experience cultures from all over the world. And, you know, culinary diplomacy, when we bring delegations over to the UAE, it's definitely a tool that we use where we basically focus our delegation around food and what kind of food we want them to experience. So I think culinary diplomacy definitely is it's a very important tool, and one that we pride ourselves in the UAE with, especially to kind of showcase our hospitality as well.
Toni, if I could jump in here for just
Absolutely.
love to reinforce some of the wonderful points that Donna made. First, you're 100% right in giving so much credit to your ambassador. I had the great honor of serving him as I was chief of protocol when he was he still is part of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps, and he was exemplary. He was the gold standard in what you should be doing to tell the story, as His Excellency states, about your country, letting people understand, why their history is so rich and interesting. And he did that in so many different ways through the various engagements. There was not an embassy, I'm sorry to say, that was more engaged than he was and his, and had, of course, the best of the best people working with him. But in addition to that, he wanted to, he used culinary diplomacy. He brought in chefs into his home and into the embassy to have this great fusion of meals that were American and also those that had the flavor of the UAE. And I actually write about this in the book when I had the honor of traveling with then Secretary of State John Kerry, to the UAE on his first engagement. We arrived, we landed very late at night, and there's the ambassador waiting for us and whisked us to the Emirates Palace, and had on the beach an amazing meal prepared for him when he arrives to have the tete-a-tete with His Highness. And it was it set a mood, it set a moment in this relationship, where he was arriving for the first time. Nothing could have been more effective in growing this this relationship closer between these two countries than what he did there. And I also have to give a tip of the hat to his amazing spouse Abir, who as well joins him in so many of these efforts, both in the United States and in the UAE.
Capricia, very well said. Zaki and Shihab, I'd like you both and Donna to add a little bit more. Step in. Capricia, and also she referenced a meeting, so I think we can tiptoe into some of those anecdotes now, gentlemen and gentle lady. Let's hear a little quote unquote dishing that was laid out. Some are, are maybe not in the book, but we might be able to extrapolate just a little.
Let me step in here, Stan, because I want also to second what was said about Ambassador Nusseibeh and our embassy in Washington. In fact, in every communication I have with our missions abroad, 124 missions, I tell them we need you to be as active as the Washington embassy is in cultural diplomacy. And I will take up a bit the idea of what we are doing now, this virtual meetings that take place in the ether, even as we face this pandemic. Personally, I am all for using the technology of tomorrow. The UAE is focused on the technology of tomorrow. We have started more than 15 years ago to establish the groundwork for an intelligent government, a government that can offer all its services online. We have established a network, an infrastructure of communications, Wi-Fi system that made life easy when we moved into the pandemic in order to move online in almost all our services. As an example, I chair the board for the Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi, and they had to move the teaching as well as with the Diplomatic Academy online. And the Sorbonne in Abu Dhabi was able to do it ahead of the Sorbonne in Paris because we were ready. And in fact, I remember when we were discussing the great museums with other museum aficionados, I was always for using technology in enhancing our museum offering. You know, museum offerings, you can never be able to get the hundreds of thousands of works of art that you would need to fill big museums, but you can always have a first-rate collection, but then also enhance it with virtual presentation of some of the artworks. And of course, many of the aficionados were dead set against it, because in the same way they say that we need to meet face to face. Of course, it is important, but we have to be ready to move online whenever we are forced to. Now, I would like to tell you then about some of the anecdotes, and I would like to relate them to the toolbox that Capricia talks about in her book. So, and she mentions the 3 sets of tools that are essential for any protocol officer. And I am glad that she merges the protocol work with cultural diplomacy and soft power, because in effect they are one. So this first is the communication tools, if you like, the communications, the ability to greet and to welcome. And this is something we have gone through from Sheikh Zayed's times, where he said, never refuse the visit of any statesman who wants to come to see to Abu Dhabi. If he wants to see me, I will see him. If I am here, if I am not, another senior representative can see him, but always welcome our guests. And this was something that was drilled into us, that we should always welcome our guests. We should always treat them as at home. We should always be at their disposal, and we should always see to it that they can tell us their story in the same way that we can tell them their stories. And then Capricia talks about the physical tools, and I found that also fascinating, because it is important, and she is right to point it out, to also choose the kind of setting where you want to meet with people. And we were in the room, even the kind of art that you can put into this room, because this can be very important in getting your story across to your visitor. And then finally, she talks about the mindset tools, and I find those the most important. And there she talks about the ability to have empathy and to be flexible. And let me tell you a culinary diplomacy that worked in the other direction. I will let Shihab talk about his. But you know, there was a lunch that was prepared for a chancellor of Austria, in fact. It was Kreisky, who was at the time the leader of the socialist parties in Europe. He came to see Sheikh Zayed many times, and he established a strong relationship with him. And we were in Al Ain, and they went into long discussions about everything, the Middle East. Kreisky was set in those years, in effect, also to find a resolution to the Middle East problem, to the Palestinian issue. He was a leading Jewish, if you like, statesman who was focused on bringing peace between Israel and the Arab countries and the Palestinians. And we had a set lunch at the time. And at that time, the director of protocol, Shihab's equivalent at the time, kept coming in every 5 minutes and saying, the official lunch is ready. The official lunch is ready. And Christy turned to him and said, look, I am not here to have lunch. I came here to talk to Sheikh Zayed, leave us alone. And Sheikh Zayed actually asked that his son, who was crown prince at the time, go to the table and start as a host at that table while he went on talking to his to Chancellor Kreisky. So that was flexibility that we learned very young. And then let me tell you about humility also in discussing with others. There was a time when Sheikh Zayed was sitting with Chancellor Kreisky, with Chancellor Waldheim, once again from Austria, and their meeting took place. Instead of the half hour that was set for it, it went on for about 2 hours. And at the end, there was a lunch that was being given in the house, in the palace of the Crown Prince. And so they took the President Waldheim to the palace of the Crown Prince. But then a minister came in and said, there is a minister that was waiting for an audience with you. And Sheikh Zayed said, who is he? And he said, he's the transport minister of a small Asian country. So it's not really important. We can, if you like, postpone this audience and bring him to the lunch instead. And Sheikh Zayed refused. He told our chief of protocol at that time, he told him, how can we do this? I mean, this is an important guest. He came to see us, and you want me to just neglect the meeting, having had him wait in my waiting room for over 2 hours? So he let that minister come in, and I assure you, he spent time with him to show him that he is just as important to him, and that his talks with him are just as vital to the interests of the two countries as his predecessor. So these are the kind of tools that I'm glad are available for us to use as we move forward in working on cultural, public diplomacy, and protocol in our international relationships.
Thank you for sharing with us. Very, very thoughtful, and I think really speaks volumes about how you and the Emirates have engaged in diplomacy and all the various aspects. Shihab, would you like to comment, please? And Donna, I'd like to hear from you as well.
Thank you very much. I just want to mention a couple of stories. One of them was when I joined protocol, a person or a friend was asking me, so what do you do? Do you just walk in front of the delegation and open doors? And I mentioned, yes, we do open doors, but not just literally. We do open many doors through diplomacy. So we had a visit of the Indian Prime Minister back in 2015. This was the first visit since, the last visit before that was 34 years ago. So it was a very important visit for us. And we wanted to make sure that this visit goes well and has a very good impact. So we had to go and look for a chef and fly him from India to come and cook special food for the Prime Minister so that we meet his requirements and give him the most respect by providing the food that they prefer, no meat, vegetarian food. So I had the task of going and finding a chef, and I did so, and I called him mentioning the importance of the visit, and we had him fly over to the UAE. And we prepared 2 sets of meals, one normal meat and everything, and the other one was vegetarian, mainly for the Prime Minister. So when they had the meeting with His Highness, we thought that we will provide 2 foods, or 2 choices for the rest, while we give him the vegetarian. So we were told back then that no, we will all eat the same food that he's having. And this sent a very strong message. Actually, the Chief of Staff tweeted right away, mentioning the respect that they've received from the UAE hosts for flying a chef, first of all, and for eating the same food that the Prime Minister was having. So not going for their own food or delicacies, but actually joining him in having whatever he was having. So this was actually a catalyst to this important relationship. And we've seen an upward trend since then. We had 2 visits both ways, going back and forth. And our Crown Prince was even hosted as a chief guest on the Republic Day back in 2017. So it gives us a very good indication that the little touches that we do actually help this relationship and any relationship that we do. So paying attention to this detail and going for the guests' interests or whatever they like, and making sure that we cater to their needs and we show them good hospitality. Then this will open the doors for other matters. So no little detail is too small. We always go for all the details.
Toni,
Capricia, go ahead.
Just a second here. I just want to say, I want to reemphasize what a tremendous host His Excellency Shihab is. On work-related matters, when I had to travel, of course, he was incredibly cordial. And I love the traditions of when you arrive, the offering of coffees or that special, wonderful mint tea, and dates, of course. But in addition to that, he hosted the global chiefs of protocol conference in his country. This is not an easy feat. This is a very difficult one. The most critical of eyes around the world are looking at every detail, and he attends to everything, every detail, big or small. He made sure that every one of us understood why the UAE attends to certain protocols in the way that it does, but also just really having us experience the richness of this wonderful country. He was an extraordinary host, and everyone left with a completely new understanding. And what's most importantly in those engagements is to create that strong relationship with him and his team personally. And he succeeded 100%.
Thank you for commenting on that, Capricia. I think it's very important. What it speaks to, especially reflecting on Zaki's comments, is I really think it's the tone that's set by His Excellency Sheikh Zayed. Or actually, frankly, from the very beginning, it starts from the top, the sense of humility, of hospitality, of the importance of receiving one's guest. It's not that every meeting may be turning out that particular meeting as a successful outcome from a policy perspective, or if you're negotiating from a private sector, negotiating a contract, but you're setting the tone for and stage for a follow-on that might yield success. So Donna, I'm interested in your thoughts, since you're doing these delegations and on the day-to-day, as you're bringing various people who are interested in art, museum directors, or the like, or when you're the reverse, bringing them to America. And one of the things I found so interesting that his ambassador, Yusuf El Otaiba, asked you to do is not just take a particular art exhibit and only have it in America's large cities, but to reach out to middle America, if you will, our smaller cities, to enhance that understanding. So how does the protocol setting and the details that you've heard from Capricia, Zaki, and Shihab fit in your toolbox?
So, the ambassadors always wants us to go outside the Beltway, to target people, not just in cities like New York or Los Angeles, but go to communities like Joplin, Missouri, or Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and really get to experience what America is. And I've noticed that when we go to some of these smaller cities, it's usually for philanthropic reasons. One of my first assignments was actually in 2011, when there was a tornado that totally, destroyed the Joplin community. And so, we reached out to them to see how we could help. We helped with rebuilding the school by actually helping them to get back online as soon as possible. Their school had been completely destroyed, and so we helped with providing them with laptops to be able to start their school year on time. But apart from that, we also decided to bring volunteers from the UAE over to Joplin to work hand in hand along with American volunteers from Habitat for Humanity to help with reconstruction efforts. And when you go to some of these communities, they haven't necessarily met people who are covered, or from my part of the world, and you can see that there's a little bit of hesitation of why we're there, but as soon as they find out the reason, they really welcome you into the community, whether it's coming with a pizza or some donuts from Krispy Kremes, or even a watermelon on a hot day. It's these kind of opportunities that really help you make lifelong friends. I've got friends now in Joplin who are, whenever they come to DC, they always make it a point to come to the embassy to meet with us. And it's also part of, Capricia's book, where she talks about experiencing America, where she took foreign ambassadors and their wives outside of Washington, DC. And so, I try doing that as well when we look at doing our projects, that we go to places like Spokane, Washington, or we go to East Lansing, Michigan. In Spokane, we got to attend an Indian powwow and meet with Native Americans and actually get to experience that whole culture, which was just so fascinating. That was during one of our art exhibitions. We've attended football games with some of our artists as well. And when we bring delegations over to the UAE, we make it a point not just to take them to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, but go to like Ras Al Khaimah, go to Al Ain, go to Fujairah, to actually get them to experience the entire UAE, because often it's, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah that are the Emirates that, most people know about. And so I think it's very important for us to be able to use the tools from Capricia's book to be able to, it's definitely going to be able to help in our day-to-day jobs as well.
Very well said. Capricia, would you like to comment, or any of our other panelists? And then we've received some questions that would be posed to our panelists. So I'd like to pivot to give the participants who've joined in this discussion an opportunity to hear from them. So Capricia, would you like to comment on Donna's remarks? And
well, I'm as I stated earlier, completely in awe of everything that Donna has done, and the forward motion that she with the embassy have made throughout the years. But I'd like to defer my time really to His Excellency, because I too want to hear more stories. The chat that people want to hear stories from him, and I'm sitting on the edge of my seat wanting to hear more from him too.
Okay, I don't disagree. So before we pivot to the questions, I do think it's important for us to just have a little bit, and Capricia, you're not off the hook. So just because you did give us a lot of really interesting anecdotes, I'm going to ask, before we pivot to the questions, just give us a little bit more insight, if you both would, on some, interesting things that may not have been embraced in your book. Or Shihab, you mentioned, well, you guys do see the inside. So something, you don't have to name names or a particular event, but do share with us just some little tidbit that we may not have known, because we're all on the edge of our seats.
Well, this is a story that I did tell in my book, and I think it really sort of dovetails well with what Donna was just saying about the importance of understanding and appreciating the cultures of others. When I traveled with President Obama to China for his first state visit at the invitation of President Hu Jintao, there was a lot on the table. Tensions were high, as we all know. Shihab can share with me an understanding, and as well, His Excellency, that the Chinese adhered to very strict protocol. And so all of the details had been ironed out in advance. And President Hu Jintao had invited President Obama to a private dinner. And this was at the Diao Tai, which is like his private residence. We would call it the Chinese Camp David, if you will. And we were in Villa 18, and all the staff was crammed into this back room, and we're just waiting, and we're very jet lagged as well. So I'm just kind of waiting for the dinner to culminate, and my counterpart approached me very eagerly, and he said, Ambassador Marshall, I have something that I must speak to you about. It's very, very urgent. And I said, well, of course, yes. And he said, President Hu has a very, very important request to make of President Obama right now, which is out of the norm because they adhere to strict protocol. Everything is, discussed in advance. So I knew this had to be really important. And he said, President Hu would like President Obama to make a noodle. And I was like, okay, a noodle. interesting. And so he explained to me why it was important and how they would do it. And I decided at that moment, I really didn't know President Obama well. We were just getting to know one another. And this was our first big trip together. So I thought, well, I'm going to, balance out. He's going to think I'm crazy versus this is the right thing to do. So I said to him, it's time to make a noodle. And who would like you to make a noodle rather? And he looked at me with this look like, what? Didn't say a word. He just stood up, clapped his hands together, and he said, okay, let's make a noodle. And he stood shoulder to shoulder with President Hu, bouncing this little piece of dough as it created this long, thin noodle, which was symbolic of the relationship between China and the US, that it would start and grow and grow over many, many years. And it was what I realized then was that President Obama understood that, first of all, I'm his advisor in these matters, and he was going to defer to me, that if I thought that this was important, he certainly thought that it was important. And secondarily, he really understood the importance of the cultural rituals and what they can do to create those stronger bonds of friendship, much more so than the discussions that they would have. This moment in creating the noodle really set the relationship on a positive path.
Thank you, Capricia. That really is a very compelling anecdote. Shihab, one brief
Okay, so
before we go to
So we had a visiting delegation, and there was a president that was visiting the country. Just to go back, we have dynamic leaders in the UAE who always are a step ahead of us when it comes to protocol or honoring of the guests. So what they do is always something that we look at, and it sets the path for the way we do work in protocol. So we had a guest, and during the official luncheon, I was sitting next to their chief of protocol. And the chief of protocol had a question. She was like, who is this minister that was riding in the back of the car? And I mentioned the name of the minister. And then she asked again, are they this important? I mean, you allowed our president to go in the front seat next to the driver, and your minister gets to sit in the honor seat in the back. This is when I said, the driver of the car is our leader. It's not a driver, and he is honoring him by driving him. So the shock on the face of the chief of protocol, knowing that our leader was the one driving their president, changed the whole perspective, because they never imagined that a leader will get in the car, drive the visiting delegation all the way to the palace and have an official meeting and luncheon with. So those small touches play a big part. And just to touch on another story, we had a visit by also the Italian Prime Minister back then, and His Highness the Crown Prince hosted him in Al Ain. It's the city where he was born, and it's the city where it's your hometown. And it was more of a cozy atmosphere, and it actually touched a point in the Prime Minister's mind. And when they hosted us again, it was in Florence, his hometown, and we went to the old municipal building, which was 500-600 years old, in that same place. So it was nice to see the reciprocal behavior that we received. And it's only because of a vision of a leadership that looks to welcome and honor the guests one more step ahead.
Both of those were wonderful anecdotes. Thank you for sharing with all of us. So let me turn, I see that the time is getting away from us, so we may run over just a smidge. Our first question goes to Ambassador Marshall from a young person who is a student at NYU Abu Dhabi, Maha Mohammed. She asks, in addition to the exceptional guidance that you share in your book, what advice can she take back to her fellow political science students at NYU Abu Dhabi in how we may begin our study of the art of soft diplomacy now as eager students with imaginably much to learn? Capricia?
Yeah, well, soft power is coined by Joseph Nye, and I would put that in alignment with, I think, what she is stating in soft diplomacy. These are the rules of attraction, bringing someone into your line of thinking, bringing someone into your way of in believing in something. And so I'm thrilled. First of all, congratulations on being part of the NYUAD. Incredibly high achievement. And I'm glad that you and your friends are speaking about these issues, and particularly today, because that's how we build bridges of understanding. That's how we create the strength in the relationship. What we need to be doing more is understanding that diplomacy is a long game. You have to invest in that relationship. And how do you invest in that relationship? Well, Shihab just talked about that respect that you give, the manners in which you greet, the manners in which you then negotiate. All of that is an investment into the relationship by showing them respect. And once you've done that, you have built incredible trust. And you can do all of that with a variety of these tools. His Excellency pointed these out from my book, which I was so grateful. But the power of place, where you bring someone to negotiate, to the food that is served in culinary diplomacy, to gifting, all of these have tremendous, make a tremendous difference. I say that protocol is a superpower because it's those minor details, those nuances that can create a major impact in whatever you are doing, from your government relationships to your business relationships to your individual personal relationships. It can be utilized in all aspects.
Thank you, Capricia. As I look through all the long list of questions, I recognize we, through our discussion, really touched on most of them, but one we really didn't get into goes to Zaki. And I did mention it in the bio or introduction I had of you, Zaki, and that's the issue of the role that interpreting plays in any given meeting. And since you were so front and center at the beginning of your experience in the Emirates, tell us a little bit how you see that role and where you saw it then and where you see it now, if you will.
Communications, as Capricia also has mentioned in her book, is very important because it is the tool that allows you to tell your story to others. Now, it happens that not all heads of states speak all the languages of the world, and therefore they have to use interpreters. And interpreting, I have always told the young people that I have trained when I was back in the presidential court, is an art. It is not a question of literal translation. You cannot sit down and simply translate one word into its equivalent, but you have to understand the whole set, the environment of that, the talks that are taking place, the objective of those talks, the subjects that are being discussed. You have to be well trained in those subjects. You have to be aware of the lexicon for each subject, and you have to be good at interpreting not only the literal words with their meaning, but also the sense of that conversation. And let me tell you an anecdote as a story, because I believe the translation is very important, and it can go, incredibly wrong if it is not done in the right way. And incidentally, interpretation, when you do it immediately in talks between two leaders, is not like written translation where you have time to think out your words. But I remember once when Sheikh Zayed was receiving some guests from a government that was quite close to us, but he was quite upset. And when he was upset, he really started harrowing them. He was, for the first time, normally Sheikh Zayed was always very diplomatic and gracious in the way he addressed his guests, but this time he wanted to give them a message. And so he gave it to him, and it was very harsh in some of what he said. And then, of course, as usual, after that, he went into describing the feelings he has of friendship for this country and the government. And the reason he was harsh was because they were so close to us. But I remember that when I interpreted what he said with equal harshness to our guests, the ambassador, who was my friend, came up to me when we left the room and said, Zaki, you know, I know that Sheikh Zayed was annoyed with us, but why the hell were you annoyed with us as well? And I said, I'm not annoyed. I just wanted you to feel, you know, in your guts what Sheikh Zayed was saying to you. That is the importance of interpretation, I believe.
A wonderful anecdote. And it's a nice way for us to bring it pains me to bring this discussion to a conclusion. But let me offer just a couple of reflections on what we've been privileged to engage in. First of all, what I heard all of you say in various iterations is the power of diplomacy, as Capricia referenced, a soft and smart tool of diplomacy. I also heard each of you really emphasize again and again and again the power of listening, of creating a framework for engagement, of building on the pillars of empathy, of communication. That's incumbent on all of us to listen so we can hear one another in order to embark on this 21st century, which is a century clearly of change, but I always like to see that as an opportunity. And it's an opportunity for us to build new partnerships and obviously, from my perspective, embrace global communities of engagement. I believe we have witnessed today and embarked on what was truly a masterclass in the art and power of diplomacy. Before we conclude, I do owe each and every one of you a million thanks. It was an incredible privilege, but a special thank you to Ambassador Yusuf El-Otaiba, a cherished friend who has always thinks outside the box, pushes each and every one of us who participated in this discussion, and we thank him for supporting this discussion, for his colleague at the embassy, Haitham Moussawi, who helped us put it together, for Donna Al-Marashi, who was truly my partner today in hosting all of you. But I would be remiss, allow me just one more comment. I touched on the issue of the pandemic on a number of occasions, but as we all know, healthcare knows no boundaries. And again, the Emirates has used healthcare to embrace partnership with us here at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. It has been a stellar pillar, a shining light of what is truly a global partnership. We would be remiss if we did not embrace and acknowledge that what it has yielded, not only in the sense of caring for children, but it has yielded in so many ways, embracing science, technology, working side by side, the new young doctors and researchers in the Emirates. We here today at Children's National Medical Center are experiencing our 150th anniversary, and that's quite something in Washington, D.C. But that partnership, which is ongoing, and I say it is a partnership because we are caring for our children here in Washington, D.C., in the region, nationally, and more importantly, globally. And we take the children and embrace those in the Emirates as our own. So from the bottom of our hearts, we say a million thank you. So with that, allow me to conclude. My best to all of you. I wish you safe journey and be well. Thank you so, so much. Godspeed.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.